Mr. Wrong lies on his deathbed, and the doctor fears he will not survive the night. An eccentric man suddenly barges in, using his powers over time to freeze the guards in place. He introduces himself as Mr. Lee, and he has one product to sell: time. 10 days ago, Lee was an ordinary man struggling to make ends meet in the big city. One day, he bumps into a man and sees that his remaining lifespan is 3 seconds. Moments later, the man is run over by a car. Lee soon realizes that he has mastery over time, able to transfer lifespans between people at will. With this power, he aims to make a fortune by offering his services to the rich and powerful. Jinner, Lee's roommate, arrives home and shuts herself in her room, mortified that she thought Lee looked cool for a moment. Lee writes in a notebook all the rules his clients must follow, styling himself as the first ever time merchant. Lee heads into the city to find someone willing to sell their time. He finds a man, Mr. Zheng, working a part-time job. He overhears that he is trying to save up money to buy his girlfriend, King, a new phone, making him a suitable target. Lee follows him into a restaurant, freezes time around them, and offers him 300,000 yuan for 1 year of his life. Zheng is hesitant to give up his lifespan, but the offer is too good to pass up, and he takes the deal. Zheng signs the contract, and a deal is struck. Lee leaves him a briefcase with the 300,000 yuan, and Zheng excitedly begins planning to buy the newest shoes, phones, and other luxury items. Lee gets up to leave, but he gives Zheng his card if he ever wants to do business again. Lee starts looking for a buyer and comes across a news article about Mr. Wrong, the patriarch of a famous and powerful family, and Lee believes he has found his man. On his deathbed, Mr. Wrong desperately struggles against the flow of time, and he wishes that he had 1 more year with his family and to lead them to glory. He opens his eyes and sees Lee, who offers him 1 year's time in exchange for 100 million yuan. Mr. Wrong's nephews are suspicious, but Mr. Wrong is running out of time, so he decides to take the deal. Lee presents him with the contract, which Mr. Wrong practically leaps out of bed to sign. In an instant, time flows into him, and he regains the strength he once had. As everyone stands stunned in amazement, Lee cheerily declares that the deal is done. Although he is still old, Mr. Wrong feels full of vitality. Lee disappears, leaving behind a note with his bank account number. As the guards are unfrozen, they are surprised to see their patriarch restored to full health. Mr. Wrong instructs them not to speak a word of what has transpired, and they promise to bring it to their graves. When he receives the note Lee left behind, he orders them to send the money. Realizing that Lee is indeed a powerful force to be reckoned with, he instructs his family not to make enemies of him. Meanwhile, Lee is pleased that his past 2 transactions went smoothly. However, he now wonders about his next move. Since his number of clients will surely increase, he ironically won't have enough time to do as he wishes. He then gets the bright idea to start an eternal club, whose members would be made up of the rich and powerful, divided into 6 levels. The higher the level, the longer the lifespan one can redeem for oneself, and he plans to make himself the most powerful member, suitable for one with mastery over time. But to put together this club, he needs reliable personnel. He hails a taxi driver, Dahai, who has a remaining lifespan of 13 years. He overhears him urgently needing money for his son's hospital fee. Dahai tells him to transfer taxes, but Lee decides to go with him to the hospital. Along the way, he learns that Dahai plans to send his son to an exclusive school, but he is unable to afford the exorbitant tuition fees. Lee stops time and leaves behind a few wads of cash and his business card, disappearing before Dahai can express his gratitude. On the way to his apartment, he encounters a man in an alley who drops a medical report. Upon entering his apartment, he sees Jinner passed out on the couch. He tries covering her with a blanket, but she wakes up and heads to her room. He walks over to his desk and begins finalizing the details of his club, which he plans to form very soon. The next morning, as Jinner heads to work, Lee drops by the real estate agency she works at, where he intends to buy property for his planned exclusive club. When Jinner sees him, she doubts he has the means to buy anything expensive, and she offers him a more modest selection. When he says her suggestions are too cheap, she decides to leave it to her junior Chen. Lee realizes that he is still being doubted, so he decides to buy their most expensive house on the market, priced at 50 million yuan. When the chiefs say they require a deposit of 500,000, Lee tosses them a card and insists he'll pay it in full. They congratulate Lee for buying their real estate, and Jinner is left speechless. All this time, she was trying to find a rich boy to marry, when there was one under her nose the entire time. As Lee leaves the agency, he receives a call from Dahai, hoping to strike a deal. Lee meets with Dahai, who is desperate for money now that his father is in the ICU. With a snap of his finger, Lee freezes time around them, and offers to pay triple Dahai's yearly wage for a year of his time. Dahai sees that he only has 13 years left to live and decides that 10 years is enough time for him to see his grandson, content that his duty as a father is over. Thus, Dahai agrees to hand over 3 years of his life in exchange for 1,350,000 yuan. Dahai thanks Li and returns to the hospital. Li wonders if Dahai will ever regret making this decision. After exiting the restaurant, Li runs into the man from before, and he instantly turns violent. Li recognizes that he only has a few days left and tells him to follow me if you want to live. Li learns the man is named Hao, and he is suffering from leukemia. When Li learns he has already been forsaken by his family, he believes Hao can be of use. He offers to prolong Hao's lifespan in exchange for his loyalty. Hao considers the offer, and he recalls how he tried to fund his own treatment to ease the burden on his family. He thinks himself crazy, but he decides to accept Li's deal. As promised, Li gives him 100 days of health, and when Hao realizes this man is the real deal, he swears his undying loyalty. Li tells him to clean himself up, and tells him to meet him the next day at the address written on a card. Li returns home, and he acknowledges the need for more loyal subordinates and professionals to make his club a success. Jenner suddenly enters in a daze, but Li can tell she is only pretending to be drunk. As she straddles Li, she tells him to take 3 shots as punishment for keeping his wealth a secret. Jenner spills some alcohol on Li, and she licks his clothes clean. Li now knows the status quo between them has changed, so he carries her into the adjoining room and reveals he knows what she is trying to do. She suddenly becomes meek, and he tells her to do what a woman does when they want to charm me. The next morning, Jenner rushes out of her room to go to work, but Li tells her to take a break as he already filed a leave on her behalf. She thanks him for his kindness, but he tells her to get into the kitchen to make him some food. This is the power of money, he tells himself. Hao knocks on his door to meet as planned. Li gives him a contract to bind his undying loyalty, letting him write 3 things that he cannot be forced to do. Without even looking over the rest of the papers, Hao signs his name, a testament to how devoted he is to Li. Li gives him his first task, to find a student named Zhang Bowen, and to give him a slip of paper. As Hao leaves, Li remarks how convenient it is now to have an assistant, but he still needs to make more preparations in anticipation of his club, and the next thing he needs is a programmer to make a member database. An unknown hacker crashes the government's stock exchange market and breaches the cybersecurity of Windsor Green, a massive supercomputer that houses valuable data regarding artificial intelligence. Experts say the culprit is either one about to die or one with a need to perform on a grand stage. Li is intrigued by these developments, and he sends Hao to Mr. Wrong's house to borrow some experts. Meanwhile, the hacker continues his work, bearing a grudge against those with control over Windsor Green and deeming himself more worthy of its use. He clutches his chest as the malign tumor causes him to wince in pain. He knows he does not have a lot of time left, so before he dies, he wants to cause a spectacle that will cause the world to crash too. He suddenly gets an alert that his firewalls have been breached. Li contacts him through a video feed, addressing him by name, Robert. With a snap of his fingers, Li shows Robert his remaining lifespan of 10 days, but he refuses to believe it, and he still believes this is another hacker-on-hacker war. Li tells Robert he has what Robert needs, time, and he challenges Robert to find him in 10 days. Robert is left wondering what to do, still unsure if this is all a trap. Meanwhile, Li thanks Mr. Wrong's hacking experts for their work, confident that Robert can find him. He remarks that, after all humans fear death. Robert arrives in China, still suffering from his tumor. He shows a guard a photo of Li's house and asks where it is. Meanwhile, Hao's health has reverted to when he still had leukemia. Li realizes he still does not know the extent of his powers, and he lacks the medical expertise to completely heal Hao. However, he gets the idea to treat Hao not as a person, but as a mass of cells. He asks Hao to supply him with a microscope and blood samples, and he gets to work. He tests out his slow time power, which he rarely uses, and finds that the blood cells each have individual lifespans. His experiment is a success, and he can now target 6 cells to slow down their rate of deterioration. Thus, he can completely resolve all the issues causing Hao's leukemia. Robert arrives at Li's villa, and Hao tackles him, thinking him to be a suspicious person. But Li recognizes him as Robert, and he has him taken inside. Robert doubts Li's power as a time vendor, which attracts the ire of Hao. Li has Hao kneel down while he works his magic, identifying the leukemia cells in his body and slowing their rate by 10 times, giving his immune system a better shot at beating it. He looks to Robert with a "how's that?" look, and Robert is stunned. Li heals Robert's tumor too, earning him his undying loyalty and respect. Robert hops aboard the Li hike train, and he readily signs a contract agreeing to help Li. Li gives him 3 tasks: to create a database of talented individuals, focusing on those near death or with debilitating illnesses, to create a database on the richest people, and to create a messaging app that ensures absolute secrecy and privacy. Robert gets to work immediately. Later, Mr. Wrong receives a package from Lee that contains a phone inviting him to the Eternal Club. His nephew gives him the note from before, which explains the club's rules, including how, based on one's ranking, one can redeem points in exchange for a longer lifespan. At the 6th level, one can exchange up to 26 years, but only if they perform certain tasks set by Lee. Mr. Wrong immediately organizes a meeting with his family, but his sons bicker and are suspicious of Lore. But Mr. Wrong decides to test the waters and accepts the invitation into the Eternal Club, and he is sent into a chat room with people dating back to the Ming Dynasty. In reality, these are mere chatbots designed by Robert under Lee's instruction. Using these personas, they manipulate Mr. Wrong into believing there are many others in the club. They then give him his first task to formally induct him into the Eternal Club. As Mr. Wrong reads out that the Eternal Club has always existed in history, a lie since this is all a farce designed by Lee, and it has 3 goals: to protect the Earth, advance technology, and advance humankind. He surmises that the people in the chat are from an ancient era and are wary of the wealth of experience they have accumulated. As such, he tells his family not to offend them in any way. He then receives his first mission, to find a suitable place to establish the Eternal Club's headquarters, specifying that it needs to be in a nice, quiet atmosphere and be between 2,500 and 3,000 square meters. Mr. Wrong slams his fist on the table and puts his sons to work at once. They want to please Lee. A few days later, Lee receives several photos of prospective locations in the mail, sent by Mr. Wrong's family. He finds one estate, with a mix of Western and Asian influences, to be suitable for his needs. They meet Mr. Wrong at the venue, and when Lee looks at Mr. Wrong's remaining time, he neglects to inform him that his aging process has not been stopped. As they tour the inside of the estate, Robert jokes that he can turn a room into a computer den, and he invites Hao, now known as Som, to find a room for himself. A few minutes later, Mr. Wrong receives an alert that his mission was completed, with an extra 100 points to boot. As he and his family celebrate their success, Lee remarks that it is time to find a new transaction. Lee places Som as his head of combat and peacekeeping, while tasking Robert with cybersecurity and maintaining the Eternal Club's online presence. As for him, he mentally prepares himself to become an immortal being, taking on the burden of guiding humanity throughout the ages. But for the time being, he and his employees need to work harder than ever. Later, Mr. Wrong gets another mission, to recruit a member of Special Forces to serve as a trainer. He sends out his sons to use their connections and to complete the task as soon as possible. Lee tasks Robert with improving his knowledge of Chinese history and quickly come up with an online database of prospective customers for his time lending business. As for Som, he needs to transform him into a human weapon and will work closely with military experts so he can become proficient in all forms of combat. Both promise not to betray his expectations. A few days later, a man named Zexer appears at their front door and immediately gets to work training Som. Meanwhile, Robert's talents are severely bottlenecked by the technology at his disposal, and Lee feels that nothing short of a supercomputer would be of use now, so he makes plans to secure one for his cyber genius. Som undergoes grueling martial arts training, which is literally beaten into his bones, but for the sake of his master, he is prepared to endure as many blows as it takes. Lee watches from afar, impressed with his strength of will. To help him out, Lee accelerates time by 100x to speed up his training. He then receives a call from Zheng, the university student whom he worked with before. Lee has a background check conducted on Zheng and learns that he spent an exorbitant amount of money on several high-end brands of clothes, electronics, and cosmetics. In addition, he recently spent lavishly at a party, making him the center of attention at his school. To date, he has spent nearly 100,000 yuan, or close to $15,000. Lee realizes that his funds must be close to drying up, and he decides to meet with him again. They talk business at a restaurant, and Lee offers to buy some of his time again, but warns him that for every year he sells, his body will age in kind. Zheng explains that his girlfriend, King, wants him to have a car and to travel the world, and for the girl he loves, he is willing to pay any price. He decides to sell 5 years of his time for 1,500,000 yuan, but he is adamant about never having to see him again. With the transaction complete, Zheng thanks him and goes on his way. Lee smiles and says, "Until next time." He calls Robert for an update on the prospective client database, and he learns that Song Shixiang, a giant in the entertainment industry and patriarch of one of the 4 great families, is on his deathbed. Lee has his next customer. The Song family is an undeniable juggernaut, having presence in nearly every industry imaginable and owning nearly half the entertainment industry. Spearheaded by their Tangren studios, Lee watches a news broadcast and learns of the upcoming wedding of Song Zuan. Zener watches in excitement, but Lee knows his 100 million from Mr. Wrong is almost used up, and Shixiang would make a great cash cow. A few days earlier, Robert told him that Shixiang was about to die, and his family was planning a wedding as a form of revivification, a concept that makes Lee laugh. On the day of the wedding, Lee takes Jinner with him as a +1, and they admire the star-studded cast walking the carpet. They are picked up by Mr. Wrong's nephew and meet his daughter, Wenwei. He calmly holds Jinner's hand and introduces her as his date. As they walk up the steps to the venue, the Song family is surprised to see Lee, whom they assume must be someone very important to the Wrongs, so they decide not to offend him. As Lee begins conversing with Zhuan, Mr. Wrong realizes that Lee insisted on coming so he could get a foothold with the Song family.